I learned the rule on my third night working the overnight ferry. The crossing was quiet. Thick fog rolled across the river, swallowing both shorelines until it felt like we were drifting through empty space. Then I heard someone screaming. A woman stood in the water off the port side, not swimming, not treading water, standing. The river was nearly 40 feet deep where she should have been. She waved both arms frantically. "Please, help me!" I grabbed a life ring and ran for the railing. Captain Nolan caught my arm before I could throw it. His face had gone completely pale. "Don't!" The woman kept screaming. The ferry kept moving, and every member of the crew stared straight ahead as if she wasn't there. By the time I started working the overnight ferry, I thought I understood the river. I had grown up around it. I knew how it smelled in July, how the fog came off it in October, how the current could look calm from shore while pulling like a living thing underneath. The ferry ran between Harrow Point and Bell's Landing, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. During daylight, it carried commuters, delivery trucks, families, tourists, and anyone who didn't want to drive 40 miles north to the nearest bridge. But overnight was different. After midnight, the river felt wider. The shore lights thinned out, the roads emptied. Most crossings had only a few cars, maybe one truck, and a handful of passengers who stayed inside with their engines running and their faces lit blue by their phones. My job was simple: guide vehicles aboard, chain off the lanes, check the passenger walkways, make sure nobody stood where they weren't supposed to stand. Captain Nolan ran the wheelhouse, Marty handled the engine room, Sarah worked the ticket booth and passenger cabin, and none of them talked much after midnight. That was the first thing I noticed. Before midnight, they were normal. Marty complained about coffee, Sarah complained about drivers who couldn't follow hand signals. Captain Nolan would crack dry jokes over the radio when the schedule was running behind. But once the clock passed 12, everything changed. The lights stayed on, the engines kept running, the ferry kept crossing, but the crew went quiet. No jokes, no small talk, no one leaning over the rail to smoke, no one looking out across the water unless they had to. At first, I thought it was superstition. Every night job has its own little rituals. Truckers who won't mention deer, hospital nurses who hate the word quiet, security guards who refuse to look at certain cameras after a certain hour. So when Captain Nolan gave me the rule, I almost laughed. We were standing near the port railing during my first midnight crossing. Fog rolled low across the river, silver under the deck lights. Nolan pointed out into the dark water and said, "If you see someone out there after midnight, you keep moving." I looked at him. "What?" "If you hear someone calling, you don't answer. If someone waves, you don't wave back. If someone asks for help, you don't throw anything." I waited for the punchline. There wasn't one. "Captain," I said, "if someone's in the river, we call it in." His eyes stayed on mine. "No, we don't." That was it. He walked away before I could ask anything else. For the next 2 nights, nothing happened. The crossings were boring enough that I started convincing myself I had misunderstood him. Maybe he meant we weren't supposed to stop the ferry without his order. Maybe it was some liability thing. Maybe he was testing the new guy. Then came the third night. The 1:30 crossing had 5 vehicles on board: a pickup with 1 headlight, a florist van, 2 sedans, and an old station wagon with a sleeping kid pressed against the back window. The fog was thick enough that both shorelines vanished before we reached mid-river. The ferry lights shone against it and bounced back at us, making the whole deck feel enclosed. I was checking the rear chain when I heard the scream. It came from the port side, sharp, desperate, human. I ran before I thought. A woman stood in the water maybe 30 feet off the ferry, not swimming, not treading water, standing. The river was nearly 40 feet deep beneath her. Her soaked hair clung to her face, her white shirt stuck to her shoulders. She waved both arms over her head like she had been waiting for us. "Please!" she screamed. "Help me!" I grabbed the life ring from the rail. Captain Nolan caught my arm before I could throw it. His grip was so hard it hurt. I turned on him, ready to shout. Then I saw his face. He had gone completely pale. "Don't," he said. The woman screamed again. The ferry kept moving, and every member of the crew stared straight ahead as if she wasn't there. For the rest of that crossing, nobody said a word. Not Captain Nolan, not Marty, not Sarah. The woman disappeared into the fog behind us, and the ferry continued toward Bell's Landing as if nothing had happened. I spent the rest of the trip staring into the darkness where I'd last seen her, trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe a sandbar. Maybe an optical illusion. Maybe someone on a partially submerged boat. But none of it made sense. The river was over 40 feet deep where she had been standing. There was nowhere for her to stand. The next night, I started looking for answers. The ferry office kept decades of accident reports and maintenance records in a storage room behind the ticket booth. Whenever I had downtime, I dug through them. At first, I found nothing unusual: engine failures, weather delays, minor collisions. Then a pattern emerged. The same stretch of river kept appearing, mid-river, the deepest section between Harrow Point and Bell's Landing. Missing fishermen, capsized boats, vehicles recovered from the water. Unexplained disappearances. Dozens of reports, some dating back more than 60 years. And nearly all of them happened after midnight. The same hours the crew became quiet. The same hours Captain Nolan refused to discuss. Around 1 in the morning, Sarah caught me reading another report. She glanced at the file. "You're looking in the wrong place." "What does that mean?" For a moment, she looked like she might answer. Instead, she shook her head and walked away. The next crossing left Bell's Landing at 1:30. Only 3 vehicles boarded: a delivery van, a pickup, a black sedan. The fog was thicker than the night before. By the time we reached mid-river, both shorelines had vanished. The ferry felt alone in an endless sea of gray. I was checking the vehicle deck when I heard a voice, faint, distant. "Hello?" I stopped. The voice came again. "Can somebody help me?" It was coming from outside, somewhere beyond the railings. A man. Then another voice answered. A woman. "Please." The hairs on my neck stood up. More voices followed, different people, different directions, all hidden inside the fog. Passengers were hearing them too. I could see people looking up from their phones and peering into the darkness. The crew didn't react, not even a glance, as if this happened every night. Then one of the voices spoke again, much closer. "Jake." I froze. The voice had said my name. I stepped toward the railing. Below me, only black water rushed past the hull. Nothing else. "Jake Mercer." My stomach tightened. Very few people working on the ferry even knew my last name. The voice continued, calm, friendly, almost familiar. "Still got that scar on your left knee?" My blood went cold. I got that scar when I was 11 years old, falling off my bike behind my parents' house. Nobody on this ferry should have known that. Nobody. I backed away from the railing. The voice matched the ferry's speed somewhere below us, always hidden, always just out of sight. Then it spoke one last time. "Jake?" For the first time since taking the job, I understood why Captain Nolan had looked terrified. Because whatever was out there wasn't asking for help. It already knew who I was. I didn't tell anyone about the voice. Not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, because I knew they would. That was the part that bothered me. The next few crossings were quiet. No woman in the water, no voices. Just fog and darkness stretching across the river. But I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Whatever was out there knew my name. It knew things nobody should know, and somehow the crew had expected it. Around 3 in the morning, I found Marty alone near the engine room. He was drinking coffee from a stained thermos and staring at the deck through a rain-speckled window. I sat down across from him. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said, "It knew my name." Marty didn't look surprised. He just nodded once, as if he'd been waiting for me to say it. "How long have you known?" I asked. "A long time." "What are they?" He let out a slow breath. "I don't know." "That's not true." "No," he said quietly. "The truth is worse." For the first time since I'd met him, Marty looked genuinely uneasy. His eyes stayed fixed on the black river outside. "When I started here, there was another deckhand." I stayed silent. "He lasted 6 months. Marty took another drink. "One night, he heard somebody calling from the water. My stomach tightened. He thought someone was drowning." "What happened?" He answered. The engine room suddenly felt much colder. Marty continued. "Didn't stop the ferry, didn't throw a life ring, just answered." "What did he say?" "We're here. Hold on." The words hung in the air. "Then what?" Marty looked at me. "He disappeared." I stared at him. "What do you mean, disappeared?" "He finished his shift." Marty's voice remained calm. "Docked at Bell's Landing, walked off the ferry." He paused. "And nobody ever saw him again." A chill crawled up my spine. "Police searched? State police, Coast Guard, everybody. Did they find anything?" Marty slowly shook his head. "Not a trace." For several seconds, all I could hear was the hum of the engines. Then he spoke again. 5 years later, another captain answered a voice. My stomach dropped. "Same thing?" "Almost." Marty stared into his coffee. 3 nights later, he jumped overboard. I felt the blood drain from my face. "What?" "They found witnesses," Marty swallowed. "Said he walked to the railing in the middle of a crossing." The old engineer's voice had become little more than a whisper. "Said he smiled." Outside the window, darkness slid past endlessly. Black water, black sky, no horizon, no shore, nothing. That's why Nolan made the rule. I looked toward the river. What are they trying to do? For the first time, Marty didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tired. "I think they want attention." The words hit harder than I expected. "Attention?" "They call." He nodded toward the window. "You answer." Another nod. "They keep talking." The ferry suddenly lurched slightly as it cut through a wake. Neither of us moved. Then Marty finished. "And sooner or later, they convince you to come closer." That night, the fog rolled in thicker than I had ever seen. By the start of the 3:30 crossing, the river had vanished completely. The ferry wasn't moving through fog anymore. It felt like the fog was swallowing the ferry. Even the bow lights barely penetrated the gray wall ahead. Passengers had begun noticing the atmosphere too. Most stayed inside their vehicles. The few who ventured onto the deck looked nervous, constantly glancing over the rails, as if expecting something. Halfway across, I stepped outside onto the port walkway. The air felt strangely still. The river was calm, too calm. Then I saw movement. A figure stood in the water not far from the ferry, watching. I froze. A second figure emerged from the fog behind it. Then a third, then another. Dozens. Men, women, children, all standing motionless in water that should have been far over their heads. The ferry continued forward. The figures never moved, never blinked, never looked away. I backed slowly from the railing. Then one of them smiled, and all at once I realized every face was turned directly toward the ferry, like they'd been waiting for us. After that night, I stopped looking over the railings. At least, I tried to. The problem was that once you knew they were out there, it became impossible not to look. Every crossing after midnight felt wrong. The fog seemed thicker, the river quieter, the darkness heavier. And sometimes, when I glanced into the water, I'd catch a shape standing far from the ferry, watching, waiting. The voices returned 3 nights later. We had just left Harrow Point. Only 4 vehicles on board, a delivery truck, 2 SUVs, a sedan. Halfway through the crossing, I heard it. Jake. Soft. Close. I froze. The voice came from somewhere beyond the port railing, hidden inside the fog. I kept walking, pretending I hadn't heard it. Then it spoke again. Jake, look at me. Every muscle in my body tightened. The voice sounded familiar, comforting, like someone I trusted. I forced myself not to look. Then another voice joined it, a woman. Please. Then another, and another. Soon voices surrounded the ferry, whispering from every direction. Passengers were hearing them now. People looked up from their phones. A man stepped out of his SUV. Others moved toward the railings. Nobody understood what they were hearing, but everyone knew something was wrong. Then a woman near the passenger cabin screamed. Several passengers rushed toward the starboard side. I followed their gaze and felt my stomach drop. Figures stood in the river, not dozens, hundreds. Men, women, children, stretching into the fog in every direction, all standing motionless in water that should have been far over their heads, watching the ferry, watching us. Panic spread immediately. People shouted, someone started crying, others pulled out phones. Captain Nolan's voice exploded across the intercom. Back to your vehicles, now! For the first time, he sounded terrified. The figures remained still. Then one moved. A woman stepped forward, not swimming, walking across the surface of the river toward the ferry. Then another, and another. Soon dozens were moving, keeping pace beside us. The River Queen was moving nearly 15 knots, yet they matched our speed effortlessly, walking through the darkness, smiling. Passengers scrambled for their vehicles, doors slammed, engines started. The voices grew louder. Then every figure nearest the ferry turned toward me at the same moment. Thousands of eyes locked onto mine, and they all spoke together. Jake. My blood turned cold. The sound rolled across the river like thunder. Then they started saying other things. My old address, my father's name, the street where I grew up, memories nobody else should have known. I backed away from the railing. The figures continued smiling, calling me closer, inviting me into the darkness. Then the ferry shuddered violently. The entire deck lurched beneath my feet. Vehicle alarms erupted. Passengers screamed. A second jolt followed, then another. The engines suddenly dropped in pitch. I looked toward the wheelhouse. Captain Nolan had gone pale. Marty burst from below deck. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw genuine fear in his face. The ferry was losing power, slowly, steadily. The wake behind us began to shrink. The River Queen was no longer cutting through the river. It was slowing down, and all around us hundreds of figures continued walking closer, smiling wider with every passing second. because they knew exactly what was about to happen. The ferry was going to stop. The River Queen was slowing down. Passengers could feel it. The engines still rumbled beneath the deck, but weaker now. The wake behind us continued shrinking. Every second we lost more speed. And outside, hundreds of figures kept walking toward us through the darkness, smiling. Captain Nolan and Marty disappeared below deck. A moment later, the ferry shuddered violently. The lights flickered, then went out. For one terrible second, everything was black. Emergency lights snapped on. The figures were closer, much closer. They now surrounded the ferry on every side, standing only yards from the hull, watching. The whispers returned, thousands of voices speaking at once, calling names, calling passengers, calling me. I watched a man step toward the railing as if hypnotized. His wife grabbed him and pulled him back. The voices never stopped. The ferry slowed again, 10 knots, 8, 5. Then I finally saw their faces clearly. They weren't drowned. They weren't injured. They looked normal, almost ordinary, except for their eyes. Every one of them stared with the same expression, the same hunger. Then I noticed the clothing. Old Coast Guard jackets, fishing gear, police uniforms, life vests, workers' coveralls. People who had spent their lives on the river. People who had answered the voices. Captain Nolan burst back onto the deck. "Get away from the railings!" The ferry lurched. The engines groaned, then fell silent. The River Queen stopped. No wake, no vibration, no movement. The river became perfectly still. For one horrible moment, nobody moved. Then hands appeared over the railings. Passengers screamed. Pale fingers gripped the steel. Figures began climbing aboard, not rushing, not attacking, simply climbing, smiling. One stepped onto the deck directly in front of me. A woman, dark hair, white shirt. The same woman from my third night. The woman standing in 40 feet of water. She looked almost human. Almost. Then she smiled, and I saw something behind her eyes. Recognition. Like she'd known me forever. She reached out her hand. "Jake." The voice sounded exactly like my mother's. Every instinct told me to take it. For a split second, I started to. Then someone slammed into me. Marty. "Don't look at them!" He dragged me backward. At that exact moment, an engine roared to life below deck, then another. The entire ferry shook. The figures froze. The River Queen surged forward. Several lost their grip and fell away into the darkness. Others simply stepped backward off the ferry, dropping silently into the river. The vessel accelerated. 5 knots, 10, 15. The figures grew smaller. Hundreds became dozens, dozens became shadows. Then the fog swallowed them. Nobody spoke for the rest of the crossing. When we reached Bell's Landing, emergency crews met us at the dock. Passengers argued about what they'd seen. Some remembered people in the water, others only remembered voices. A few claimed nothing unusual had happened at all. I quit 2 days later. Captain Nolan didn't try to stop me, neither did Marty. Before I left, Marty handed me a thin folder. Inside were decades of reports. Missing captains, missing deckhands, missing fishermen, missing police officers. Every case connected to the river. Every one connected to voices in the dark. On the last page, someone had written a single sentence by hand. The river doesn't take people. It learns them. I never worked on the water again, but sometimes my phone rings after midnight. No caller ID, no number, just silence. Then the sound of water and a familiar voice, soft, patient, waiting. Jake, every year it sounds a little closer. And that's where my time on the River Queen ended. I never went back to Harrow Point, never stepped onto another ferry, never worked another job on the water. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I can still hear those voices, calling from somewhere beyond the darkness, waiting, patient, like they know I'll answer eventually. So now I'm curious. If you were standing on that ferry and heard someone screaming for help in the middle of the river, would you stop? Or would you keep moving? Let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about terrifying jobs, unexplained mysteries, and the things waiting in the dark where nobody should be, make sure to subscribe to Campfire Horror Stories, because the next shift starts soon. And trust me, the river isn't the only place with rules you're never supposed to break. Sleep well.